morning once again. If you have your Bibles and you want to flip over, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 3 today. And once again, we're going to read all of it. So if you want to follow along, I'll give you a minute to start turning there or pulling it up on your phone or your iPad, however you choose to access the Word this morning. And while you're doing that, I'll go ahead with our introduction this morning. As we gather together in a large group of people in a certain place, there are things we can do that very quickly incite panic in that group of people. And one of the most tried and true, one of the quickest ways is to yell one word, and that is fire. Even today, with all of our fire suppression techniques and literally a fire station most of the time around most corners, it doesn't take much more than the word fire to make us start to worry. Our pulse quickens, our eyes start darting back and forth, we start looking for those exit signs. So let's just take a moment right now and we'll note where we can go. And I'm actually kind of wondering about that one. I don't think, that's a discussion for another day. Okay. Maybe don't go out that door. Go out those if you need fire. Okay. And that word elicits these type of reactions for a reason. We innately hold a certain fear and respect for fire. Aristotle developed what we call the classical elements when he theorized that everything on earth was made up of one of four things: earth, wind, water, and fire. And while each of those can have destructive tendencies, I mean, we live in a place where we deal with some flooding on some scale. We also deal with tornadoes, some wind damage. Nothing seems to create that fear or panic in us like fire. And again, this is for good reason. Fire is incredibly destructive. This is a picture from the big California wildfires back in 2018. I mean, if that doesn't strike fear into you, I don't know what else could. I mean, that's just devastating. There's also this creepy kind of near human parallel where fire needs oxygen and food to continue to live, more or less. And that's one of the reasons they're so difficult. I mean, if you think about this picture right here, I mean, how do you deprive a fire of food and oxygen in an open forest? I mean, what are we supposed to do? There's a certain sense in which it just runs away. This is one of the reasons we continue to have or process this fear of fire. Fire can be incredibly destructive. It can also be constructive. It can incite fear and panic, and fire can also, in small doses, create a sense of peace and calm. What's more heartwarming than a nice fire on a cold day? What is more comforting than a few well-placed candles? Fire can be destructive. Fire also can be constructive. It's played a very important role in the development of our society. We think back to these images of cavemen discovering fire and how far we've come from there and what all we've used it for. Ever since that moment, we've been using fire to create things in our world. It has this incredible transformative property. Fire, before we had electricity, was light. So fire turns darkness into light. Fire turns cold into warmth. Fire allows us to take metals and turn them into liquids, and then to forge things with them. Thus, throughout time, fire has come to represent for us this moment of intense change. We describe the fires of life as this process that molds us, that puts us in this position where we're almost broken, but then we emerge something different and maybe a little stronger than we were before. And that change, the fire experience, can change us in one of two ways. It can be destructive, and it can also be constructive. In a lot of ways, we owe this motif of the fires of life to a story that we read about in Daniel chapter 3. To our three friends that we learned about in the first couple of chapters, a story here involving Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We're studying through the book of Daniel right now, chapter by chapter. This morning we are heading to Daniel chapter 3, and usually at this point I'll give you a little recap and tell you where we've been and where we're headed, but we'll get to that in a minute because it's going to play a very specific role in something that's going to happen here at the beginning of chapter 3. So if you don't mind, we're just going to dig right into chapter 3, and then we'll hit our recap here in just a minute, and it will help explain a little bit of what's happening here. Daniel chapter 3, and we'll begin in verse 1, and we'll read the first 6 verses before we stop. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Okay, so a lot just happened there in the first 6 verses, and we might have a lot of questions about what just happened, and in particular, why those things are happening. So first, let's talk about this image, or we call it the statue sometimes. What is it of? We often think of it as King Nebuchadnezzar, and that's probably the most logical explanation, which we'll talk about why in just a minute. It also could have been, some people argue, of his god, Marduk. We're not told explicitly what the image was made to represent. It could plausibly be either. But in the grand scheme of things, for our story, it doesn't really matter. Because regardless of what the image is, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have not wanted to bow down before anything. They're not idol worshipers. They're committed to worshiping God and God alone, so they wouldn't have felt comfortable bowing down to whatever the image is made out of. We're told it's fairly large, about 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And this brings up some more questions. This is an interesting ratio. Even by this time in world history, people had come to know that the human figure was developed at a 5-to-1 ratio. This is very tall and very slender for a human statue. So what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? Some historians believe this might have been on purpose, that this would have been visually unsettling. The people would have looked at that and went, "Oh, that's odd. That's a little imposing." They wanted it to maybe inspire fear in those who looked at it. Next, pay attention to the list of people that are invited to this idol worship session. When we typically think of this story, we often think of just like the world, and Nebuchadnezzar says, "Okay, everybody in my kingdom has to do that." But that's not who he invites to this first ceremony. And to be honest, when the Bible starts going through this laundry list of all these titles and names and things, I tend to zone out till I get to the end. But we have this laundry list, and it appears twice really closely together, which makes us think we might should pay attention to it. So look back at that list and think, who is it that Nebuchadnezzar invites to this first one? And it's all his government leaders, and it's his government officials. So why does Nebuchadnezzar invite his employees to this big first christening of this giant creepy statue that he built? And third, we're told that at the sound of the symphony, all in attendance must bow down and worship this grotesque statue, or risk being immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. And this is also interesting. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians are noted polytheists. They believe in all kinds of gods all over the place, and undoubtedly there are people in his kingdom who worship certain gods and do not worship others. And there are other people in his kingdom that worship those other gods but don't worship some of the others. Why the big hubbub about this one statue? What is happening in this moment? And why such a harsh penalty if they don't? I think we can find those answers by going back to our recap, which I said would come in just a minute. Daniel chapter 2 in particular, the text we studied last week. In Daniel chapter 2, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar, the same king here, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And the dream really worries him. And in this dream, he is told of a future that might happen. And so he wants to know what this dream means, so he calls all of his wise men, his employees, his trusted advisors, and he calls them in and he says, "Okay, I want to know what this dream means, but I want to know that you're not going to lie to me. I want to know that you can do what you say you do, so I want you to tell me the dream that I had, tell me what it was, and then tell me what it means." They said, "Well, we can't do that. We were not there. We didn't have the dream. We can't tell you what it was." So Nebuchadnezzar gets really angry, and he orders that all of the wise men in his kingdom be put to death. And that includes Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel says, "Buy me some time. I think I can figure this out." He returns back. He calls his friends. He asks them to pray for this situation. And God answers their prayer. God shows up, and he reveals to Daniel what the dream was and what the dream means. Now, about that dream, Daniel chapter 2, verse 31, we'll recap it really quick. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue." Is this sounding familiar? An enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance, and the head of the statue was made of pure gold. This is also sounding familiar. Its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken into pieces, and they became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. So Nebuchadnezzar's had a dream about a statue, one in which Daniel tells him later, his kingdom is part of this statue, and his kingdom is made out of the gold part of the statue. And we read the story and we get to the part about the rock that's cut out not by human hands that strikes the statue and wipes it down. And we think and we believe this is the coming of the kingdom of God. And that gives us hope. Nebuchadnezzar hears that same part of the story and thinks, my kingdom will come to an end. My kingdom is going to end. And even before the rock gets there, Daniel tells him the next part of the body is this chest and arms made of silver. That there is another kingdom that's coming after his. His reign will end. And this fills Nebuchadnezzar with fear. And so, if this kingdom is coming, if someone is going to overthrow him, he guesses, it might be one of my employees. It might be someone that I've already given power to that will incite this rebellion. So what this tells us is now that we get to Daniel chapter 3, this is a test of loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar creates this statue. And he says, probably of himself. This is why most likely we believe that the statue was of him, but in an imposing way. And he brings all of his employees, all of the people that he's given power to, and he tells them he wants them to bow down and worship him. So he'll know who has allegiance to him and who doesn't. And this is why the penalty also would be so severe. The furnace would have also been pretty convenient, given that it would have been needed to create the statue. So, I mean, we already have it. It's already working. So this might be the penalty. It's also a pretty symbolic way to end someone who doesn't bow down to the statue, to be deposed in the fire that had just created the statue. So now our scene is set. Nebuchadnezzar has built the statue. He's called in all of his advisors, which now include Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as they're called in Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We have a paranoid king inviting all of his trusted officials out into the plains for a loyalty test. Let's see what happens, continuing in verse 7. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down, and they worshipped the image of God that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the name of God, and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very well. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are now forced into this decision, and they have chosen not to bow down before the statue. The astrologers are the ones who notice, and they bring this to the king's attention. And as we'll find out again later, they are set on eliminating these people. It is the God of the Jews that keeps showing them up and telling Nebuchadnezzar that they don't really know what they're doing. It is this God who keeps being a thorn in their sides, and they're ready to get rid of these guys who have shown that they're all smart and all that sort of stuff. So here are these guys, Nebuchadnezzar. They're not bowing down. They report this back to Nebuchadnezzar, and he is filled with rage. And now we know why. His biggest fears are coming true. And not only are these people in particular filling him with rage, it is these people in particular because they are not native Babylonians. They're people who came in Daniel chapter 1, and they were brought into the kingdom and trained, and now they are officials. So if there's going to be someone who's not going to bow down and who might try to overthrow him, wouldn't it be one of these guys? So he's filled with rage, and he gives them one more chance. He says, listen, we're going to play the music again. Maybe you didn't quite understand the edict that we sent out, that when the music plays, you have to bow down. So let me explain it clearly. These are the stakes. When the music plays, bow down, and if you don't, we're going to throw you into the furnace. And his invitation ends with this incredibly foreshadowing question. Then, once you're thrown into the furnace, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Let's keep going. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the image of gold that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent, and the furnace was so hot, that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement, and he asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not even scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. I love that we include the smell thing, because if you've ever been around a campfire, you smell like campfire for a month. And they say they come out of the fire and they don't even smell like fire. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation, language, who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the province of Babylon. The response from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a defiant one. They refuse to bow down, and the order is given to heat the fire 7 times hotter than usual and get these strong soldiers to tie up the boys. And Nebuchadnezzar is trying to leave no doubt in their minds of what is about to happen to them. There's no way of getting out of this, he wants them to know. The fire is so hot that the soldiers who approach it die. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not killed. In fact, in the midst of the fire, Nebuchadnezzar looks down and he says, I thought we threw 3 people into the fire. Yeah, we did. Well, there's 4 of them in there. And then he says, and one of them looks like the son of the gods. If you're reading that and you're thinking Jesus, yeah, you should be, right? But this is this moment in which I don't want us to go past it. We're going to focus on a different part of the story to end today, but this is just too good not to just hang on for a second. God shows up. And where does God show up? In the fire. God doesn't show up and yank them out of the fire. God doesn't show up and quench the fire. God doesn't stop it from burning. But God is there with them in the middle of it. God is the God who shows up in that moment and joins them in the middle of the fire. But the thing I want to focus on as we end this morning is this incredible response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We noted in Daniel chapter 1 that when they were taken over by Babylon, they were probably 13, 14, 15, which means now, as they're standing before Nebuchadnezzar, they're probably 17 or 18 years old. And I want to hear what they have to say when Nebuchadnezzar gives them one more chance. I think there are three things that we can take from this response, and they're pretty much divided for us verse by verse. So go back to verse 16, and we're going to focus on 16 through 18 here. Actually, we'll back up a little bit, and we'll hear Nebuchadnezzar's threat, and then we'll listen to what they say. Beginning in verse 15, but if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods, or we will not worship the image of gold that you have set up. They begin with this idea, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. Because a purposeful, godly life, rooted in the teachings of God, rooted in the teachings of God that transform our lives and how we live and act in the world, that kind of life needs no defense. They stand before Nebuchadnezzar and say, we don't have to defend ourselves. You know who we are. You know how we've lived. You know that we've done X and X for your kingdom. You know us. We do not have to defend ourselves in front of you. Jesus teaches this in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount. Is my clicker lost? Give me that next one, Kelly. Maybe not. We're frozen. There we go. You are the light of the world, Jesus teaches. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Jesus says that when people see how we live, and they see the good that we're doing in the world, that they will praise God. Notice that Jesus didn't say when people hear your very finely crafted arguments, they will be convinced that they're wrong. Jesus didn't say, when you lob proof texts at them, they'll realize that you have Bible-backed opinions, and they will change. Jesus says when they see your good deeds, when they see what you're doing in the world, they will praise God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are standing before Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, we don't have to defend ourselves. You know what we're about, and you know who we are. You know that our lives have reflected these choices, and you know that this is what we're going to do. When we as Christian people feel motivated to stand up and constantly defend our beliefs and defend our opinions, which, let's be honest, is most of Christianity's MO at this point. When we feel so compelled to defend ourselves all the time, maybe one of two things is happening. First of all, maybe we're defending the wrong things. And second of all, maybe the rest of our lives are not mirroring those things we're trying to back up. Because when we say them, people go, wait a second. And then we have to start defending ourselves again. But a life rooted in God, a life changed by God, a life that goes out and shows those good deeds in the world needs no defense. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego can stand in front of Nebuchadnezzar and say, we don't have to defend ourselves in front of you. You know who we are, and you know what we're going to do. The next one, verse 17. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. These guys have complete confidence in what God is going to do. They have complete faith and trust in him. How do they know that? Because even in the first 3 chapters of Daniel, this is not the first time that these guys have stood out or stepped out in faith. This is not the first time that they've faced persecution. This is not the first time that they've made unpopular decisions or that they've leapt hoping that God would catch them. It's not the first time. They're able to stand in front of Nebuchadnezzar and say, we believe that God's going to do this because they've already seen God do it. They have faith that God is going to do this. They have faith that God is going to be there. We spend most of our lives trying to avoid these exact situations. We spend most of our lives trying to avoid moments where we have to step out in faith. We spend most of our life trying to avoid or insulate ourselves from the heat of the fire. And here they are saying, we're going to jump out there. Here's the fire, and here's us. And we believe that God is going to be there. If we never step out in faith, how would we know that God is going to be there? If we never leap, how will we know that God is going to catch us? They know because they've done it. And so they can stand in front of Nebuchadnezzar and say, well, we believe that God is going to do something here. Let's read that and then flow into our final thought in verse 18. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. What an incredible statement of faith. Even if he does not. We believe that God can rescue us, they say. We believe God is able to. And we believe that God will, they say. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your statue. Even if he doesn't, our allegiance is still to him. We will still worship him and not your gods and not the statue that you've erected. Sometimes we fret the situations before us, the tragedies that happen, the moments where we feel like God didn't answer our prayers, and say, God, where were you right there, right? God, what happened? I prayed so hard for this, and then it didn't happen. Or where were you when this tragic thing happened? As if God not answering our prayer in the way we wanted him to affects whether or not we believe he's there or not. Even by the 3rd chapter of this book, we've seen God do some incredible things to these people. And it might be also easy for us to say, well, sure, if God did some of these things, it'd be a lot easier to stand up and say, I believe that God will rescue me. If God had shown up in some very tangible ways like he's done in the first 2 chapters already before this point, it'd be much easier for me to believe. And sure, God has done some incredible things in these first couple of chapters. But one aspect that we don't talk about very often in this story is that there are many unmentioned instances of unanswered prayer. Or at least where God didn't give the answer that they were looking for. Think about where they came from in Daniel chapter 1. Think about what happens with Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. Do you think that as devoted to God and as prayerful as we've seen them be already, do you think that they didn't pray for deliverance when Egypt took their king away and imposed their own king? Do you think that they didn't pray for deliverance when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians then defeated the Egyptians and took over Jerusalem? Do you think that they didn't pray for deliverance when Nebuchadnezzar sieged Jerusalem and literally starved them out until they got so hungry and thirsty that they said, you know what, we give up. We will submit. We will become Babylonians. You don't think they prayed for deliverance from that situation? Do you not think that they prayed for vengeance when Nebuchadnezzar looted their temple and took the holy items of their God and placed it in the temples to their idols? And they didn't pray for God to show up and do something there? Yeah, God miraculously answers several incredible prayers from them in these first 3 chapters. But there's also ample evidence that there were times when he did not, at least not in the way that they wanted him to intervene. And they're able to stand in front of Nebuchadnezzar and say, we believe that God has the power to rescue us. And we believe that God will rescue us. But even if he doesn't, our faith is in who God is and not in what he can do for us. Our faith is in who God is and not just in what he can do for us. Is our faith rooted in who God is? Or is our faith rooted in what he can do for us? Tell you that next slide there is 2 Timothy chapter 1. For this reason, Paul writes to Timothy, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but it gives us power and love and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord or of me, his prisoner. Rather, join with me in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. We love that verse in 2 Timothy chapter 1. For that the Spirit that God gives us does not give us a spirit of timidity, we say, but he gives us a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And absolutely yes. But we often skip the part that in the next verse, Paul invites Timothy in that power and love and self-discipline to join him in suffering for the gospel. So often we think that if God's going to show up, God's going to pull us out of the fire. God's going to shut the fire down, and God's going to pull us out, and he's going to hold us up and say, look at what I did. Look how I rescued my people. But so often God doesn't do that. God just joins us in the fire. And Paul writes to Timothy and says, the spirit that God gives us does not give us a spirit of timidity. It's power and love and self-discipline. So come and join me in suffering for the gospel. Come and join me, because here God shows up. It's here that God joins us in the middle of this. And it's here where we see his actions most tangibly. Fire has come to represent for us a moment or a process of incredible change. The fires of life can be destructive, or they can also be constructive. Will the fires that we encounter in this life devour us? Or will they fan into flame the gift that God has given to us? Is our faith in who God is or what he can do for us? Would you join me this morning as we sing one more song? Josh is going to come up. If I can help you or pray for you this morning, please come and find me as we sing together. Josh.